So, hey guys, I wanted to do a short video to let you know the first of my videos on Voddie's book, Fault Lines, is about to be released on Facebook, and that should happen a little bit later today. It takes a while for a large video to upload. In the meantime, since I've done 4.5 or 5 hours of video on this, I wanted to give you a succinct overview of what to look at and just a couple other brief notes. Yesterday, Bradley Mason posted a screenshot of one section of Voddie's book, and it has to do, in the very beginning of the book, with definitional content, setting definitions for what we're talking about. Voddie's seems to, or appears to, go out of his way to quote from critical race theory authors themselves to let them speak for themselves in setting the definition, and then goes with that. And that, of course, is what we would want. The problem, as Bradley pointed out when he posted this yesterday, is that this section is not that. In fact, now I don't think Bradley elaborated too much on this. He just said this is poor scholarship. It is, in fact, sinful, in his words. And the reason for that, I spend a lot of time at near the 2/3 mark or so in this first video. And I think it's very important to draw attention to. I cover 3 aspects in all of these videos that I'm going to do. The main one is his definitional content and his twisted distortions, and in fact, how do I say this without being too harsh? Lacking. Let's put it this way. It wouldn't pass any university test. It would probably get you censured if you were a member of a secular university faculty. It would probably get you fired if you were a journalist. It is very poor. It is, and I'll describe it more in just a second. But the definitional content, some of the applications of justice that Voddie covers in his section on true justice, and then thirdly, I draw some from the section on his ideological kind of presuppositional worldview interactions, to use the terms he uses when he says critical race theory or critical social justice creates a new religion, a cult as they put it. It has a new canon of scripture. It has a new priesthood of people you have to listen to versus those you don't. And I wanted to deal a little bit with that. And then finally, in the last video, I spent some time talking about what's really going on here. Why do so many people accept a book that, as you will see, is deeply flawed? I'm not just talking about has a couple deep flaws. It is deeply flawed throughout, systematically flawed. Why is a book like that so overwhelmingly lauded and praised throughout the Christian and conservative world, at least the conservative Christian and conservative political world, as being the book and all of that? This speaks for me. Why could that be the case? What are all these people missing? I think you will see if you have the time to go through this. And the first part of it deals directly with what Bradley posted yesterday, and I was so glad to see it. I think he actually also dealt with it in an older blog post. I would recommend you go read those and look at them. And I want to look at it even more deeply because I have some things to say about it. He just didn't go that far, and maybe he's nicer than me. Maybe that's the case. That's not a very high bar, I understand. And so when you look at these sections, and there's one part where he quotes from the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs as giving a definition. And as you will see in the video, the problem is it wasn't from that School of Public Affairs. It wasn't from UCLA. It wasn't from the school at all. It wasn't sanctioned. It was just a group of students that had got together and used this definition. Now in the video, you'll see me saying this is not used anywhere as a definition. And it turns out since then I've found one instance where I believe it was, who's the journalist that started his own kind of thing. Why his name is blanking my mind at this moment. Maybe I'm getting old. Anyway, you'll find it. It was used in a post from a Christian journalist who who does have a large platform. And so I can see from there where Voddie might have gotten that it had some prominence. But nevertheless, he says it's been used in many discussions, and that's still not true. But I wanted to correct my own error in the video that's going to come later. Just number one, so that you can see I can admit my own flaws, and number two, that maybe you will see an example of how we can self-correct our own errors here. Nevertheless, second of all, the main part, and this is what Bradley posted yesterday, is what Voddie calls, I believe it's on page Roman numeral 16, here it is, the 4 key presuppositions. And I'm going to try to put, and of course I don't expect you to read that, but you can see that's all in a big block quotation there. I spend a lot of time going over this, and I get pretty exercised about it. And I want you to know that you may think I'm being too harsh, I'm even being unchristian towards Voddie, but this is an academic and journalistic error, the likes of which would get you laughed off any stage, would ruin a credibility of a career in many venues, and should here also, unless Voddie were to come back and admit that he really screwed up here and apologized. But to give a long story short, and I elaborate on this a lot more, the long story short is, here's a place where Voddie is presenting their own words as their own definition. At least that's what he's saying he's doing. And in reality, what he's doing is he's adding his own straw men into the words in multiple places to twist what they mean. And I'm not making this up. You can't make this up. This is mind-blowing that this even has to be said, that this happened. But, in some cases, he's even blending the words together where there will be partially a direct quotation, and then right next to that, without distinction, Voddie's own words, which is a twisted, distorted, something nobody would agree to, but it's the perfect straw man to demonize CRT. Voddie blends all those words together and then adds a footnote as if all of it were the words of the CRT proponent, in this case, Richard Delgado. My friends, you can't put words in the mouths of your opponents. Worse than that, you can't put straw men in the mouths of your opponents. I mean, it's false witness to begin with. It's even more egregious. It's the most egregious form of false witness I've seen. And I was just thinking about this again this morning. I've been in scholarship, some of it at the academic level, for 15, 17, 18 years, for a long time. I got my Master of Divinity in 2007. I got my PhD in 2012. That was 9 years ago now. And I've seen scholarship from all over the world, the top notch, the highest reaches you can get. And I've had even some of my own articles in peer-reviewed journals. Okay, I've published books, I've edited books, I know what I'm talking about. And I can promise you, I can say that in all of my years of reading hundreds of thousands of pages, millions and millions of words, I have never once ever seen a case of academic dishonesty, of a lack of academic integrity, an infraction so egregious in my entire career. I have never seen one even close to this. And yet the people who are just eating this book up are not in a position to go check, and the ones who are just don't, because they're uncritically accepting this stuff. But Voddie Baucham is not just your random pastor who happened to get a platform. He is the dean of a seminary or of a divinity school at a Christian university. He ought to have impeccable scholarship. He ought to have, at the very least, very good scholarship. And this is nowhere near that. This is at the very lowest levels of infraction, if not, and I just hate to say it because I know it will turn people off more to me than to him, but if not dishonesty, the effect of it is intellectual dishonesty. Because you can't put your own demonized version of what someone says as what they believe, let alone their own words. And that's what Voddie does in this book. And you're just going to have to read it and go through it with me to see, because I'm trying to keep it short here. So in the definitional section, I go over those two. In the section on justice, And by the way, that sets the tone for the entire book. There's hardly a page or a section throughout Voddie's entire book that doesn't contain errors of that style. Most of them aren't quite to the same magnitude as that one, but that really does set the tone for the whole book. So that when we get to the section on true justice, Voddie goes through many cases in which, you know, well, this black guy was shot here, but I can find a white guy who had the same scenario. So, and he goes through and he shows statistics, and so he looks at studies with statistics as well as several individual cases. And he begins that section talking about Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling and all of that. And I mean, even through all of those narratives, there's just point after point that needs to be corrected that has been twisted beyond recognition, or there are narratives told about individual shootings. After Voddie's giving these lectures about how we need to have all the facts before we decide, so that he's shooting down the liberal narrative because they're not giving you all the facts. And then he gives you versions that only have half the facts in them. And I give you an instance or two, where I bring up the rest of the facts and show you that at the very least, this kind of balances out the narrative, if not strongly tilts it in favor of, yeah, they shouldn't have shot that guy. And Voddie doesn't tell you any of that stuff. He paints the picture from Voddie's perspective, which is really kind of the conservative, very conservative, slanted Fox News type perspective, where it's not about getting to all the facts and the truth. It's about shooting down liberals, beating Democrats. And I want to beat many of their beliefs in the same way that you do as conservatives. But I don't want to do it through lies and half-truths. And that's what Voddie presents here, is many cases it's just half-truths and spin. And then in the third section that I cover, Voddie talks about how wokeism, or critical justice, social justice as he puts it, is a new religion. It's a cult, and it's got its own priesthood and its own canon. And again, point after case needs to be addressed, and there's just no way you can get to all that. So I try to take a few representative examples. And in this one, I look at an example where he talks about Ibram X. Kendi, and how his whole career is about nothing but creating new definitions for words, and then, you know, trying to kind of wage this propaganda campaign based on new definitions of words. And Voddie literally says that after partially quoting Kendi out of context. He says, see there, he says that this is his whole journey is all about new definitions, not about action. And Voddie literally says that. He's not about action. And of course, the entirety of critical theory from the original formers was about nothing more than action. And Kendi stands, he may not call himself a critical theorist or a critical race theorist, but he stands in that tradition. And if you read the rest of the book from which Voddie quotes, and again, Voddie doesn't tell you any of this, if you read the rest of the book, Kendi gives you example after example of places where his definitions of racism must flow into actions, and he actually did it, or at least tried it. You know, where he's involved in marches, where he's involved in helping organize things that are racial activism. So, I mean, this is just an utter straw man, and it's really unnecessary. It's like, why would you say that about a guy when the very book you're quoting from and twisting says just the opposite? And the same happens with a couple of evangelical figures in, I think it's the New Canon chapter from, I'll try this, John Onwuchekwa. And you'll hear me absolutely butcher that name in the actual videos. And I deeply apologize for that. I should prepare better for it. However, John O, as he's affectionately called for that reason, is addressed by Voddie, I think, terribly unfairly. Again, pulling stuff out of context, magnifying that as if that only were the truth, ignoring the context which mitigates the very point he's making and puts a whole different understanding on it. Voddie doesn't relate any of that. The other one was David Platt's sermon on Amos 5, which a lot of people didn't like. However, when Voddie presents it, it is so ridiculously one-sided. He doesn't even quote from it. He doesn't even link to it, and yet he quotes a bunch of people who want to shoot it down. Why do you do this? I don't understand why people do this. I cover these and some other examples throughout the book as representative examples. Again, there's no way to cover it all without doing 30 hours of video or doing 30 videos. It's voluminous, and I think it's unnecessary. When we go through these multiple examples, you will see. And the truth is, if you get past that first instance of where he talks about the definitional content and you still have any respect for the book and the intellectual effort presented here, and possibly even for the person who did it, you may just choose, okay, my mind's made up, I don't need to hear anymore. And I would say, I'm tempted to say, rightfully so, because what he does with those 4 key presuppositions, alleged presuppositions, and the dishonesty with the way he treats them and footnotes them and puts words in the other guy's mouth, it should lead to church discipline, honestly. And I'm not exaggerating. There is not an ounce of hyperbole in what I'm saying. I am dead serious. And I don't say that as a way to get Voddie. I don't say that because I'm his opponent. If my best friend did this, I would go to him and say, dude, you cannot publish this. This doesn't, I'm in the office right next door to where Gary North works. And if he did this, I would go to him and say, Gary, you cannot publish this. And if I did this, I would hope that I had friends and editors who would say, what in the world are you thinking? No, we're not publishing this. Say, no way we'd publish this. And yet Voddie is praised and lauded throughout the evangelical world for doing this. There's a statement, there's a quotation I'm fond of using, even though it comes from the atheist, the infamous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche. And it goes, when you fight a monster, be careful that you don't turn into a monster in the process. And that's my paraphrase of it. And it's even more applicable here because the monster that these guys are fighting is really, in most ways, a monster of their own creation. It doesn't exist, which means that they're culpable to begin with. But then when they fight it, it's like there's no limit on the number of misrepresentations and lies that are told in the process of doing it. So that in fighting this monster, we're becoming worse than the very monster we're trying to stamp out. And for some reason, we're okay with that. And I don't think we should be. So that's why I did this video, and it's already longer than I wanted it to be. It's an egregious, egregious example. It cannot be censured deeply enough. And I want you to listen. And if you want to go, if this longer video gets up and you want to go listen to that part first, skip to about 1 hour and 29 minutes into the 2.5 hour roughly video. 1 hour, 29 minutes. And you can listen to that first as I go through this section, and you can see for yourselves the depth of what Bradley was talking about. And like I said, he doesn't cover it just in that post, but I will put the picture that he shared in the comments to this video, and you can look at Voddie's version of it for yourself as you go through it with me in the video. And that's not to say that the hour and 29 minutes leading up to that you don't need to hear. I think you'll profit from it, but I understand it's also very long, and you may want to get to this section first. So I would, for those of you interested, I would highly recommend that. So that's what's coming, and there's more coming, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me here and there when it comes. And as always, I appreciate your time and your attention. And as I get the opportunity to provide more on these topics, I'll try. So thank you all.